Well, first off, let me just say a huge thank you to Daryl and everyone at Ogallala Commons who helped put this event together. I'm, extremely honored to be invited to share a little bit of my research with you all, and very, sorry that I can't be there in person to learn as well as present. What I'm going to present is based on research that I did for my dissertation. And it's mostly grounded in materials at the Southwest collections at Texas Tech University. If people are interested in kind of learning more, that's a great place to start. And as Daryl mentioned, by way of background, I did my training in environmental history at Rutgers University, but my family's also from kind of rural Eastern North Carolina. And one of the things I've always been interested in is kind of trying to understand the nuances of the social relationships that underlie agriculture, and how those relations in turn really shape and are shaped by the material world around us. And I know I don't have much time with you all this morning, so I'm going to dive right in. And like probably most history talks, I want to begin with a story. So on May 6th, 1965, A.C. Oliver decided to write to his congressman, George Mahan, for help. Oliver at the time was 36 years old, a father of four, a veteran of the Korean War, and a proud West Texas farmer. He was concerned about how intensifying drought conditions that were unfolding that season would impact his ability to successfully raise a crop. In the previous decade and a half, farmers like him had come to withstand such droughts through irrigation of their crops from the Ogallala, but this season was different. For the first time since the widespread adoption of groundwater pumps, West Texas farmers would not have the ability to contract workers through the Bracero program. This was a long-running guest worker program that brought Mexican nationals into the United States on temporary farm work contracts. Most farmers on their own at the time were unable to physically move the kind of cumbersome pipe and sprinkler systems that were bringing groundwater from the pump to their crops, and were unable to find sufficient labor on the local market to meet the kind of intensive and really time-constrained demands of irrigation. And so this young farmer pleaded with his congressman to convince the government to reestablish some sort of Bracero program. And he ultimately concluded his letter with a warning. If this labor shortage was not remedied, irrigators would, quote, be forced to quit. Now, Oliver was not alone in voicing his concern to Congressman Mahan at the time. Filed away in a folder at the Southwest Collections are a series of similarly worded letters that were sent to this long-standing U.S. representative of Texas's 19th district. The decision of these farmers in this moment of frustration and desperation to write to their congressman, I think leaves a kind of really rare trace of these, transnational labor stories that were really fundamental to building a groundwater irrigation economy in the Southern Plains. So today with you all, I want to explore how braceros came to be responsible for installing and managing a significant portion of irrigation equipment in the Texas Panhandle. I'll begin by offering a little bit of background on, the history of irrigation in the 1950s and why the kind of structures and governance of the Ogallala led farmers to seek out workers via this kind of transnational labor program. I then want to recount that history from the perspective of the braceros and spend a little bit of time, considering how they experienced this early period in irrigation. And I think that this story, highlights some of the maybe unique tensions and demands of trying to irrigate from a private and confined water source like the Ogallala. But also, I think, by using kind of historical analysis, we can gain a lens into a period in the aquifer's history that was contingent, it was experimental, and in particular, it was human-centered. And I think it's a period where, the future of the aquifer, maybe was still yet to be determined. Okay, so I want to go ahead and dive right in. And some of this slide in particular might be a little familiar to a lot of you. So the conditions that led to the employment of braceros as irrigators in the Southern Plains was, primarily shaped by the sudden and rapid infusion of groundwater into the economy in the late 1940s and 1950s. right? This is a period where thousands of farmers were being convinced to purchase West Texas farmsteads by the promise that access to water from the Ogallala would guarantee them a crop each season, regardless of, the sporadic rain patterns. Um, and this surge in demand for groundwater was further supported by the circulation of more affordable pump technologies, most notably new devices that were compatible with Ford V8 engines, the enactment of favorable regulatory frameworks, which established the portions of the Ogallala lying within Texas, at least, to be firmly subject to the rule of capture, and the appearance of intensive drought conditions in the early 1950s. Um, Now, this is a story of kind of exponential expansion, I think, is very well recorded. What's less studied is, I think, the predicament that many of these farmers faced once they pumped that water to the surface of these newly acquired farmsteads. So for most of these initial farmers, they relied on, ditch and flood irrigation techniques. These are, extremely common approaches for managing the flow of water around the world, but they created specific limitations for irrigating with a non-renewable and commodified water source such as the Ogallala. The biggest of these concerns was the issue of water waste. Ditch systems are relatively easy to construct, but they're, also prone to overflows and spills. Moreover, since these systems require keeping water exposed to the elements, it was prone to evaporate as it sat under the hot Texas sun. As one report from Texas Tech revealed in 1955, at the time, upwards of 20% of the water that was being pumped for irrigation was being lost to seepage and evaporation, right? And for farmers, these losses were directly impacted in the diminished value of their property. So the result, was that many farmers began to experiment with more efficient and less wasteful irrigation systems. One of the solutions was the installation and use of underground pipes. Concrete piping was cheap and readily available. Moreover, these pipes ensured that water could safely, move throughout the farm without incurring such losses from waste. And yet, while making the transition to underground pipes was, this kind of quick and cheap way to save water, the approach also demanded a tremendous amount of labor. It required finding employees who would be able to manage the kind of physical demands of moving these heavy lines, but who also possessed a level of ability and expertise that was necessary to meet, the time-sensitive and complex demands of watering crops. And I think most critically, it meant that in what was this, still sparsely populated and labor scarce region, farmers now needed to find such workers outside of the kind of traditional harvest, migratory patterns and cycles, right? They needed to find people during the spring watering season, when there was less access to workers. And I think the main point here, right, is that for this initial generation of pump irrigators, valuations of the Ogallala quickly became embedded within questions of labor procurement. While many were being drawn to the region by the allure of, the aquifer and what it might mean, their future ultimately hinged on whether they could find enough workers to move that water. There we go. Okay. So, faced with this prospect of wasting precious amounts of groundwater and struggles to meet these emerging demands via the domestic labor market, many farmers increasingly began to recruit workers through transnational networks, in particular the Bracero program. So, I provided kind of like a general timeline, and I'm going to move a little bit quickly through the kind of nuts and bolts of the program at a high top-down level, so that I can spend a little bit more time focused on the stories of, the individuals who went through this experience. But what I think is important to note here is that the Bracero program was not initially conceived to relieve the kind of labor shortages like the one faced by irrigators. Established in the middle of World War II, the program was designed specifically to relieve hand or quote unquote kind of unskilled labor shortages during harvest seasons specifically. As the program persisted and evolved after the war, growers began to explore ways of redesigning its structure to be more favorable to their specific needs. Um, so one of the main drawbacks to making the program functional for irrigation work in particular was the kind of temporary nature of Bracero contracts. So initially, farmers were forced to contract new employees every few months. This kind of random assignment of workers encouraged braceros to return to Mexico with their earnings, and it also meant that growers would need to spend precious amounts of time each year training new workers, which made it almost untenable to have them perform the kind of tasks that were necessary to manage these irrigation systems. And so, to meet the labor demands of pipe irrigation systems, growers began to use loopholes in the Bracero Agreement. And these loopholes became known as the I-100 Initiative and the Specials Program. These were programs that were initially spearheaded by leaders at the Immigration and Naturalization Service who managed the flow of braceros across the border. And they allowed farmers, first through this I-100 initiative, the opportunity to rank their employees based on whether they felt they were worthy of a second contract. And then through this specials program to actually recontract the same workers season after season. So unlike traditional bracero contracts, which would, randomly place workers with farms and only do so on these short-term contracts, this program ensured that farmers could reliably and cheaply access the best of the best workers available within the program. And at the same time, train those same employees to be able to increase their capacities on the farm. And on the slide, what you're seeing, and I know it's a little hard to read, is an example of one of these contracts from 1961. And this has been collected as part of the Bracero History Archive. This is a really wonderful digital resource for those that, maybe want to learn a little bit more about the program at a more general level. And I know it's hard to see, but this individual contract was made through the Anton Producers Co-op Gin. And in the description of the work, you can see that there's a differentiated set of rates for kind of quote unquote farmhand work, and then the work that the individual was doing as an irrigator or tractor driver. And what's I think really great is that alongside documents like this, the Bracero History Archive also contains oral history interviews. And I think that these firsthand accounts really provide the kind of clearest distillation of both maybe the tenuousness and the possibilities that were embedded in the specials program. In one such account, Juan Losa, who was a bracero, details how this system brought both increased financial opportunities, but also proximity to issues of discrimination. So Losa first learned about the program in 1957. That year, he boarded one of 20 buses that was filled with over 1,500 prospective workers on their way to a contracting center in Monterey. And after waiting for a month in Monterey while working in a restaurant and living on its roof, Losa finally made it to the border city of Piedra Negras, where he again was forced to wait to be assigned a contract while also being required to submit to an intensive bodily exam that was a kind of consistent part of this program and exposed workers to a number of different kinds of chemicals and toxins at the time. Now, Losa was aware that not everybody who made it kind of this far in the process was guaranteed a contract. And even if he was able to acquire a contract, that it did not come with guaranteed hours. And so what he did was he aligned himself with a more experienced worker who helped him navigate the process. And after waiting a week, the man suddenly grabbed Losa when an announcement was made for 200 irrigators. And as Losa recounts, the next morning, they boarded a train that took them to Lubbock County. And recalling the experience, Losa noted that Lubbock was a very good place to work because, quote, everything that is produced in that county needs irrigation. Now, upon arrival, Losa worked for 3 consecutive irrigation seasons in the Lubbock area. With a contract that paid him 55 cents per hour, which was a 5-cent increase on the kind of standard Bracero contract, his schedule included periods where he would work 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week to ensure that crop rows were sufficiently watered. As part of this contract, he also learned how to drive a tractor so that he could carry plates, piping, and sandbags to help kind of move water within the farms. What I imagine they were using some kind of ditch pipe kind of hybrid system. After the watering seasons ended in August, he was then able to return to Mexico to visit with his family. before having the opportunity to come back and recontract with the same farm that he was working at the season before. During his time on the farm, however, Losa also encountered, racist interactions, primarily in restaurants, coffee shops, other public spaces, that led him to, uh, decide to seek out work elsewhere. And so over the next few years, he used his skills as a tractor driver that he gained under the specials contract to find work in places like California, Michigan, and Arkansas. And I think, as this story illustrates, for the approximately 20,000 Bracero workers who at one point were employed as as specials in Texas, these opportunities to work as tractor drivers, as irrigators, offered a route towards greater security within a work environment that could at times be hostile and exploitative. And so in addition to higher pay, these positions offered a range of less obvious benefits. For example, Manuel Romero describes how he preferred to work on the night shift, as this allowed him the opportunity to avoid kind of more overbearing forms of supervision, as well as the hot sun. While many followed the path of Losa working in a kind of variety of places throughout the US, others stayed in the same place, working on the same farm for multiple seasons, some working on the same farm in this program for up to a decade. And a number of these individuals, like the two folks you see, the photographs of here, were able to use their positions as in this specialist program to leverage for U.S. citizenship. So these are actually their passport photos. And underneath it says one of their primary skills was working as irrigators. And in other contexts, braceros played a key role in the desegregation of public facilities. And now I'm going to jump very quickly to the end of the program. But due to a number of reports of abuse and worker exploitation, the program the national program was ended in 1965. And is noted in that opening letter for farmers in the Texas Panhandle, this decision could not have come at a worse time, right? With the onset of this drought that was beginning to occur and limited time to figure out an alternative way to irrigate. And yet, while many farmers were rightfully worried about how they were going to water that season's particular crop, others saw the kind of far graver meaning of this decision for this emerging farming community. And that was a turn towards automated systems such as the center pivot. So in contrast, to the kind of low upfront costs of underground pipe systems, center pivots required significant, investment. I don't think that's a surprise to say here. These were concerns expressed in the letter sent to Mahan in 1965. People saw this at the very moment that this was beginning to take place. As one letter writer noted, while some could afford to mechanize, quote, for the vast majority, this is proven to be too costly. And I think it's important here to pause on, maybe this direct relationship between the ending of the Bracero program and the mass adoption of center pivots. Advertisements from the time, like the one you see at the bottom of your screen, clearly show that promoters foregrounded the kind of labor-saving capacities of these systems as part of their pitches for a shift towards sprinkler systems. Moreover, it was only following the ending of the program that farmers really began to make this shift toward automation. So center pivots had been around since the early 1950s, but their uptick in actual purchases doesn't begin to take place until the late 1960s. In 1969, there's around 1,200 of these wheel-based sprinkler units in operation throughout the Panhandle. And just 4 years later, that number had ascended to over 5,000. But still, for over a decade, really, farmers' ability to raise an irrigated crop ultimately depended, on the certainty that was provided by this transnational work share agreement. This relationship allowed farmers to remake the landscape of the Texas Panhandle, but at the same time, it gave workers unprecedented leverage in an otherwise precarious migrant labor market, which they in turn used to advocate for better working and living conditions. So I had to ask a question that I don't always ask in giving talks like this, and that because I'm talking to people who are far more invested in kind of the contemporary moment. Um, the question I think, maybe to be raised is, what to make of this story. And so I'm going to give my best shot at that here. So bear with me. And this is me wrapping up, by the way. I think that it's often easy to see and think of the history of the Ogallala as a lesson kind of in the inevitability of depletion and despair, right? I just saw an article yesterday, a blog thing that was titled, quote, "The High Plains Aquifer is approaching a point of no return." I don't think that's an uncommon thing to see. And yet, as I believe the rest of this conference's presenters will demonstrate, right, the aquifer has a long history that has reverberated far outside of the Panhandle, and it's one that continues to contain immense possibilities for imaginative thinking. And so my hope, I guess, is that, maybe as everybody goes along over the next 2 days, and unfortunately I can't be there to do this with you, um, but that you might consider how those futures and the technologies and the sciences that will take you there can also learn from the past and start to also work to center and strengthen the kind of ever-evolving social bonds that have equally played a role in transforming the Ogallala into what it is today. Thank you, everyone. Okay, I hear I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that hopefully I can get questions.
Hey, Sam. You mentioned AC Oliver at the first. I personally knew him and was just kind of curious how he, started the program or was integral in it.
Yeah, wow. I apologize. There's like a little bit of delay, but I believe I heard the question. So I I would just describe him as a employer of Braceros. That's really I'd love to kind of connect because I think it's really interesting. I was curious about using names in this presentation because I thought maybe people would actually know the people that were involved, which is great. But he was one of like a number of people. So in that file that I mentioned, there's actually hundreds of letter writers that were really invested in prolonging the campaign and played a kind of really pivotal role in lobbying for its persistence over the course of the late 1950s and 60s. From my perspective, in terms of like research, though that letter is the only document that I found from him specifically. But yeah, I would obviously love to like learn more about kind of any individual role of people, but I can't really speak more than what was on the letter, I guess.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
There's an echo. Um, with the Braceros immigrating from Mexico, I'm curious about the immigration patterns, as in when they came from Mexico. I don't know if you came across much of this, but did people come from one region in Mexico, and then did they move to uh a region in the United States, like stay together, or was it just people from all over Mexico going all over the United States? Like, were they concentrated in where they moved? Like, you could go to, somewhere in the Panhandle and look it up and say, well, these people immigrated from this section of Mexico, and they're everyone in this town is from this specific town
Mhm.
in Mexico or this region in Mexico.
Um, n- Within the context of the Bracero program, no. It was far more like you would kind of show up as an individual and could very randomly be assigned a job in Texas. You could be assigned a job in New Jersey, Arkansas, California. Um, what was kind of unique about this specials program was that if you were able to get one of these contracts, you could find a kind of local workspace, a farm maybe that you actually had a really good experience on, and go back to that very same farm. So one of the things that I'm kind of interested in going forward is trying to tease out those actual relationships a little bit further. And I don't have like the best evidence for like how to describe that, but at a kind of broad level, there's not the kind of like specific geographic connections that you're asking about within the context of the Bracero program, at least. And that was, I should add, it was intentional by the design of the program, because one of the kind of key tenets of it was to keep workers kind of circulating throughout the system and not enable people to kind of gain leverage by, you know, migrating with family members or migrating to and building a kind of community. Though it was kind of intentionally designed in the program to prevent that.
Um, yeah, I've got another question. Have you come across data on how many of the braceros ended up owning land and going into agriculture?
That's a really good question. And I've really tried to kind of find that. I don't know the answer, to be honest with you. It's very hard to kind of retrace those the kind of like you're able to find evidence of people, you know, as they, you know, pop up in the program, and then afterwards, often the evidence is like, okay, now they're gone, right, from the archive. I think that's a question that would be really wonderful to find out the answer to, but I'm not entirely sure I know how yet. But hopefully one day I will.